Morning again. And here I am yet on the third day breaking my own rule, but why not, right? At least I'm consistent. So, just a reminder to agrégés and associates who are interested, you are invited to meet at lunchtime in Curacao 8. Curacao 8. And those who are involved in the closing ritual today, there will be practice here in the ballroom at lunchtime. And the rest of you just go do whatever you want at all those times. Okay, just for a sense of where we are going today, we'll begin this morning with a presentation by Professor Turi Kunin. Following that will be a panel who will be addressing more of what we just saw in that video, knowing that today we will be focusing on the Immokalee Farm Worker Coalition. After our break, we will be led through a contemplative reflection discussion based on the See, Judge, Act model. And we will end our morning with a call to action in a variety of ways. At our break today, we have invited Sarah to continue to share some of her song with us. So if you would prefer a little more quiet, she will be in the ballroom during the break, so feel free to come in and out at your own pleasure. This afternoon, we will have the Gathering of the Graces, followed by the closing ritual and the banquet celebration this evening. So that's a sense of today. We all know that any violation of the integrity of a human being is something that is antithetical to who we are, who we claim to be. And so today, as we educate ourselves, listen, and reflect on how we can be more active in working against human rights violations, we can see a bridge from our last event, especially those of you who were there. If you weren't, you've heard about it. We focused then on sex trafficking and made great strides with the ECPAC Code of Conduct and the hotel where we met. And many good things have flowed from that. And so today, our focus is on another kind of trafficking, but just as evil, and that is on labor trafficking. So that will be the focus of our justice session this morning. And it is my pleasure now to introduce Maria Elena Perales, who is the Justice Coordinator from Orange. Maria Elena.
It is my pleasure to introduce our speakers for this morning. Turi Kunin has worked in Chile and Central America with torture victims and the families of the disappeared. After studying law at University of Cincinnati, he was selected for the Justice Department Honors Program and served there for several years advising judges on immigration and refugee law. He went on to litigate asylum and torture victim protection cases throughout the country. He also worked with the UN Subcommission for Human Rights in Geneva and the UN High Commission for Refugees in Washington, D.C. He continues to litigate pro bono, asylum, domestic violence, and trafficking victim cases nationwide. Our panel: Lupe Gonzalo, one of the leaders of the Coalition for Immokalee Workers, is a powerful voice for farm workers' dignified wages and working conditions. Originally from Guatemala, Lupe worked over 10 years harvesting vegetables under some of the worst harvesting conditions one can imagine. Today, Lupe works full-time, empowering and educating other farm workers about their rights. Shelby Mack. She's an organizer for the Student Farm Worker Alliance, who works very closely with the Coalition for Immokalee Workers. She is also working with various faith organizations and groups throughout the country. She is constantly educating other young adult people about food justice and the key role they play in speaking out. She organizes and participates in marches and raising awareness about farm workers' rights and other various actions. Sister Mary Ellen Gondek. She's a member of the justice team for the Congregation of the Sisters of St. Joseph. She also represents her congregation in the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility. As a member of our planning subcommittee, she has played a key role in leading conversations between CIW, Coalition for Immokalee Workers, and Wendy's management. I now invite our speakers to the stage. Please come and join us. And I invite us to extend our hands in blessing over our speakers and joining in the song of blessing.
Oh, Spirit, guide them now. 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 In your way, guide them. Oh, Spirit, guide them now. Oh, Spirit, guide them now. Oh, Spirit, guide them now. In your way, guide them.
Thank you very much. Now we have Terry Coonan. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Maria Elena, and thanks to all of you for the opportunity to gather with you to look at what we now understand is going to be one of the great human rights issues of the 21st century, that of human trafficking, but labor trafficking in particular. I want to also, first of all, say that it's a great honor to be with my friends and colleagues from the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, one of the great farm worker advocacy groups here in the United States, but even beyond that, one of the great human rights groups here in the United States. So, Lupe and Shelby, it's an honor to be with you today as well. And I guess I would also like to thank all of you that are gathered here in this room from a personal perspective. I am an alumnus of Catholic schools. I have grown up, you have taught me. It was Catholic women religious who not only taught me in grade school, high school, later on at the University of Notre Dame as well, but who also introduced me to Catholic social teachings, one of the great roadmaps that we have for being difference makers in the world. Even as one who now works at Florida State University at a state school, it remains the great roadmap for us for human rights work, for comprehensive and really human rights work based on the notion that we are created in the image of God. That is actually where the impetus, where the energy of all of our justice work comes from. So wonderful to be a part of that tradition and wonderful to join all of you here this morning. A little bit of background on myself before I talk about labor trafficking. Again, as I had mentioned, I was introduced to the whole world of social justice through my experience in Catholic schools. When I graduated from the University of Notre Dame, I thought of becoming an attorney, but at the time I didn't know any attorneys that I respected. They all seemed like a somewhat slippery bunch of people. So I did what, in fact, a lot of young Irish Catholic men have done over the years. I decided that instead I would go on for the seminary, that I would pursue studies to become a Catholic priest. I went on for studies with the Holy Cross Fathers that had also taught me at the University of Notre Dame. And I can remember my first year there in the seminary at Notre Dame. For those of you that know South Bend or Notre Dame, the seminary is on the edge of campus, pretty much surrounded by cornfields. And I can remember going to bed every night in a seminary that seemed entirely too quiet and entirely too removed from the world. And I can remember praying, "Dear Jesus, get me out of this seminary. Get me someplace where there are real issues, where the church is out there making a difference in the world." It was our Irish poet Oscar Wilde who said that when the gods wish to punish us, they answer our prayers. And the Holy Cross priest asked me, "Would you like to go to Chile? Would you like to go to Santiago, Chile, where we have a district of our priests and nuns working? It is a military dictatorship, but would you like to go there and spend several years working?" And I jumped at the opportunity. The first night that I was in Chile, they had what they called an allanamiento. This was, again, in the midst of this quite repressive military regime where Chilean military and secret police came through the very, very poor neighborhood that I was living with the Holy Cross priests in and just began shooting randomly. It was to terrorize the population. And I can remember one of the priests yelling to me from another room, "Terry says, take your mattress off the bed, put it on the floor, and sleep away from the windows tonight." And I can remember still falling asleep to the sound of gunfire that night. And I can also remember thinking, that seminary back at Notre Dame, that wasn't the worst place in the world. The quiet cornfields seemed quite attractive at this point in time. What I also remember, however, I ended up spending about 4 years there in Santiago, Chile, living and working with the Catholic Church Human Rights Office. It was called the Vicariate of Solidarity, La Vicaría de la Solidaridad. And what it was the Catholic Church hands-on human rights work. It taught me once again how vitally important the Catholic Church is for working with the most vulnerable of victims, whether they be in a military dictatorship or whether they be in our own backyards here in the United States. I also learned a great deal as I look back on that time period about trauma, the kinds of trauma that I saw in the lives of young survivors of torture, the group that I most worked with in the 4 years that I was in Chile. The same kinds of trauma I now see in the lives and the faces of human trafficking victims here in the state of Florida. I ultimately came back, I pursued actually human rights law studies, became a human rights lawyer, and for most of the last 2 decades I have worked in the justice field as an attorney, as a human rights attorney representing victims. And I could have never guessed 25 years ago in Chile that the same trauma that I learned to recognize in the faces of torture survivors there, we would now see in the lives and the faces of human trafficking survivors right here in Florida. In 2000, Florida State University asked me to come on board and to start a human rights center. I teach law and criminology there. I also teach courses in film, in social work, in social studies. But what we mostly do at our Human Rights Center, in addition to the 50 or so human rights courses that we sponsor throughout the university, we work with victims. We provide pro bono legal advocacy for survivors of trafficking, for torture survivors, and for asylum seekers. What we have seen increasingly in recent years is that our largest caseload is actually trafficking survivors now. This has been, I think, for many of us, the wake-up call that this is, in fact, one of the great human rights violations of this century. What I'd like to do today is to walk you through a little bit of what we continue to learn about the world of labor trafficking. I also do the same for judges and prosecutors, FBI agents, and also advocates around the country. And it is really the experiences of our victims, but also of our advocacy groups like the Coalition of Immokalee Workers that greatly inform what we know and what we now realize we need to do to combat trafficking. When we talk about human trafficking, we talk about really as modern-day forms of slavery. Two types of human trafficking. One that Patricia mentioned, sex trafficking, exploitation for commercial sex, but also forced labor, labor trafficking, of which we see actually far more victims and far more cases than sex trafficking. Trafficking can often involve crossing an international border, especially if the victim is a foreign national who is exploited here in the United States, but movement is not at all required. And what we are quickly learning is that U.S. citizens are equally vulnerable to trafficking, especially labor trafficking. U.S. law tells us that there's basically three ways our prosecutors can prove up trafficking, either showing that force, fraud, or psychological coercion has been used to keep people in a situation in which they cannot leave. One of the reasons why this is a huge human rights issue for the 21st century, we now estimate that there's about 27 million modern slaves around the world. That is more slaves than at any time in human history. Truly sobering for us to understand that, try to wrap our heads around that in the 21st century. They do estimate that anywhere from 500,000 to 2 million people are trafficked across international borders every year, and that approximately 15 to 18,000 come here to the United States, are foreign national victims, immigrant victims of trafficking. We have seen a host of trafficking cases and types of trafficking around the United States in recent years. They actually comprise the largest number of trafficking cases, the largest number of victims. Curiously, labor trafficking occurs in plain sight, and in another very sobering realization, it often involves very, very legitimate U.S. businesses that either know or choose not to know that human trafficking is occurring in their supply chains. These are a number of the venues where we have seen labor trafficking around the United States. In agriculture, in the area that our Coalition of Immokalee Workers has done such monumental work in, but also in our hotels and resorts, in sweatshops and industry, private homes, what we call literally house slavery. Our diplomatic staff, in a number of instances, have been shown to have actually slaves that they have brought into the country. But we've also seen peddling rings. We have seen things in the service sector. Again, people subcontracted to clean our buildings, to actually oftentimes dispose of unsanitary materials. Many of them can be trafficking victims. Also, nail salons and massage parlors and strip clubs, where the crime may not be sex trafficking, but where young women are oftentimes paying off a debt and forced to do so by labor trafficking, by dancing in that strip club. A number of cases, just to walk you through very quickly. The first case, again, led efforts by our Coalition of Immokalee Workers, called the Navarrete case. 2008, took place here in Florida, in Immokalee, not far from here. These were the two brothers of a family, a Mexican family, that decided that they could locate, retain, and then exploit workers from Mexico and Guatemala to work in their family tomato fields. They recruited these workers locally. Oftentimes, our foreign national victims have a debt that they are having to pay off, a smuggling debt, but this was not one of those cases. It was the Navarretes that created a debtor system by plying these young men from Guatemala and from Mexico with beer and drugs and adding those costs to the room and board that they supposedly owed that family. That became the coercion. That became the invisible chains that actually held those workers in that situation. In this case, it was more than just invisible chains. The men were actually chained into a boxcar most nights. They would put 6 of them or so, chain them to hooks in the walls of this boxcar to make sure that they did not flee, to make sure that they were still there the next morning, ready to be exploited. Cesar Navarrete was the recruiter, and his brother Giovanni was the enforcer. Men were routinely beaten, many of them whipped, again starved as well. Ultimately, 6 members of that Navarrete family were convicted of human trafficking, of Social Security fraud, and also of harboring undocumented immigrants. It was our coalition of Immokalee workers, as they have done in so many other cases, that provided the hands-on victim care after these victims were rescued. This is a modern slavery museum, a boxcar that our coalition of Immokalee workers have taken nationwide. The same kind of boxcar where those young men were literally chained at night. Our coalition has taken that kind of boxcar and made it into a living testimony to where slavery actually exists in our midst. They have driven that all over the country. It has been parked on the U.S. Capitol lawn. It has been parked in front of the Human Rights Center at FSU. I don't think our landlord knew that there was a boxcar parked on our lawn, but we didn't tell him. It was a great thing just to have the coalition and their traveling museum provide quite live testimony to how it is that slavery can thrive in our midst. What we have quickly learned is that it's not always immigrant victims. Another case that come to us from the Jacksonville and the Palatka area involved U.S. citizen victims. In fact, all African American men and women who were recruited from homeless shelters by a trafficker who knew that people living in homeless shelters would be the almost perfect victim, that no one would miss them if they were taken. They were actually lured to Palatka, again, miles away from any kind of major U.S. city. They were working there on potato and cabbage fields. A company store motto was used to actually drive up worker debts. And a large part of that debt that they had to pay was money for crack cocaine and alcohol that they were provided on a nightly basis. The trafficker exploited the vulnerability of a substance abuse issue and very, very intentionally recruited people who had a substance abuse issue with either alcohol or with crack cocaine. This was the scene. This is a slide that law enforcement used at the trial, ultimately, of the prosecutor. You can't tell real well, but the barbed wire on the top of this fence angles back towards the camp itself. This was very important for our judge and jury to understand that the barbed wire was not meant to keep outside intruders from coming into the camp. It was meant to keep those people there in modern-day slavery. You can see the picture of the men in particular when they were rescued, gaunt, emaciated, all of them undernourished, and all of them abused through this nightly routine of crack cocaine or alcohol that was used to fuel their addiction and also to keep them there, to keep them in that camp with a mounting debt. We have seen actually crime scenes in much nicer venues as well. This is what's called the Sandestin Hilton. It is a 5-star hotel up in the Panhandle, the Destin area, a quite nice area. It was also ground zero for a labor trafficking case. Another area where we have seen labor trafficking is in our U.S. hotels. This was a scheme that actually exploited hundreds of young women from Eastern Europe, from Russia, Poland, Ukraine, and Romania. And these were all students who were studying hospitality management. They came into the United States legally on what's called a J-1 visa, a visa meant to show them how it was the hospitality industry operates here in the U.S. They were all recruited, they didn't know it at the time, by Russian organized crime. They were signing contracts in Eastern Europe that brought them to Orlando. They would get off the plane here in Orlando, and they would be told by someone else in the Russian crime family, there's good news and bad news. The bad news, the job at Disney World you were supposed to work has disappeared. There never was a job at Disney World. Instead, the Russian crime group would then take them up to the Panhandle, where the good news was that there were jobs waiting for them in this 5-star hotel. But they were told, it only pays about $1 an hour, but you'll get to work 70 hours a week, and you will get to sleep. You can tell there's a condo right behind that hotel where these Eastern European girls slept on the floor, 20 of them to a room. All of them had plane tickets to come back to their home countries, but they all understood that if they actually left early, it would cost them several $1,000s to actually use that plane ticket at an earlier phase. So almost every single one of them decided, we'll stay here in the United States. We'll work 6 days a week. We'll have 1 day to go to the beach, but we'll work 70 hours a week, and we'll make $70 a week. After about 3 months, they would go back to Eastern Europe, and there would be another group of young female victims brought into these hotels. When the FBI investigated this along with Homeland Security, they found out that it was Eastern European organized crime, actually about 7 different groups. Normally they compete viciously with each other, but in this case they collaborated. One group would take responsibility for people coming here, others would actually be the ones to bring them up to the panhandle, others would renew their passports fraudulently. It was a great reminder how organized crime can also, in a globalized world, actually collaborate with one another. We ultimately found out that it wasn't just that hotel, it was all over the panhandle. We ultimately, when we looked further, realized it was all over the southeastern United States, that Russian organized crime was operating in a host of our 5-star hotels all over the U.S. We found other crime scenes that are also equally nice. One not far from here in Boca Raton, in golf resorts, that involved a Filipino couple that had the brainstorm that they could recruit young Filipinos off of cruise ships, young men and women that had spent a number of years moving all over the world, but making very, very little money and really having no station in life. And these young people were recruited to come here to Boca Raton, where this was the crime scene. The Boca Woods Country Club, one of the nicest golf resorts in Boca, and it was young Filipinos who were being brought in to work in their restaurant, to cut their grass, to actually do all kinds of standard labor. And they were being held in one of the nicest neighborhoods of Boca Raton, almost 50 of them in this one house. Their passports and their ID documents were taken from them. The traffickers had some kind of relationship with a local ICE agent, again, our Homeland Security. Not that the Homeland Security person knew what was going on, but at one point, he actually had all their passports. He made a house call back to the house to deliver their passports stamped and gave them back to the traffickers. That confirmed for these workers everything their traffickers told them, that there was a U.S. official who was in their pocket, who made house calls to deliver their passports back. Gave the passports not to the workers, but to the traffickers. The case broke thanks to a very, very alert Catholic priest in Boca Raton, a Filipino priest who realized finally that there were 50 Filipinos begging for food outside of his parish every Sunday morning after Mass. He very alertly called the Filipino consulate in South Florida. The feds ultimately recognized it as a trafficking case, but it was actually opened as a wage and hour violation by the U.S. Attorney, or actually by the Attorney General here in Florida, Bill McCollum at the time. Became one of the largest trafficking cases we have had in Florida. Final couple cases to look at. Labor trafficking in industry. Back in 2013, a lawsuit was actually announced against a company called Signal International. It was a company that specialized in shipbuilding, but also in all the kinds of building that goes along the Gulf Coast here. And they received very lucrative contracts after Hurricane Katrina to rebuild much of our Florida Gulf Coast. So many contracts, in fact, that they lacked workers. They reached out to guest workers in India to actually meet that need. But what they did was trafficking. It was not standard labor recruiting. They actually brought these 500 guest workers to the United States under false pretenses. They recruited them, but also charged them tens of thousands of dollars recruitment fees, completely illegally. They told the workers that they would get permanent residence here in the United States, which was a lie. And they actually then confined them to very, very overcrowded camps in Texas, Mississippi, and Alabama. The bosses referred to these as man camps, their sort of derogatory term. But this is where anywhere from 20 to 30 workers were actually kept. Workers who complained about this were threatened with deportation, but in a landmark ruling just last year, a federal court in New Orleans ruled that Signal International would have to pay $14 million in damages to these workers. It was a civil lawsuit, not one that attempted to put the company people in jail, but rather to sue them for civil rights violations. Again, the largest civil finding in the U.S. history at this point. There are actually criminal charges now pending against that company as well. The last type of labor trafficking I wanted to walk you through today involves what we call domestic servitude, house slavery. Some of the most egregious and some of the hardest cases to actually detect here in the United States. It was back in May of 2007 that the employees of this Dunkin' Donuts shop in Long Island actually very, very early in the morning found an Indonesian woman, ran into their restaurant, could speak no English, but showed signs of extreme physical abuse. She had escaped from a millionaire's home, the home of a millionaire couple, Mahinder and Varsha Sabhinder, owners of a multinational perfume business there on Long Island. This first victim had been held for almost 6 years as a virtual house slave in this $2 million mansion on Long Island. You see the picture of this mansion here? She eventually testified about routine abuses that she and another worker from Indonesia had been subjected to. Routine beatings with brooms and umbrellas, being cut with a knife and burned with scalding water, even forced to consume chili peppers and then eat her own vomit when she would vomit. The U.S. officials that ultimately investigated this case understood immediately that these were torture survivors, things that they had survived right there in this mansion in Long Island was clearly the sorts of things that torture survivors from around the world also survive. These were the pictures that were used in the trial against these two traffickers, horrendous physical abuse that they suffered. A great reminder, I think, to many of us, many in America who think that, oh, labor trafficking, it's not as bad as sex trafficking. This kind of photo and the stories of our labor trafficking survivors very, very much counter that kind of stereotype. They very, very much carry the same kinds of trauma and in many cases have been subjected to that trauma for years on end. They are among the most wounded people that we actually continue to work with at our Human Rights Center. Ultimately, it was the woman in this case, Varsha Subnani, who was identified as the prime perpetrator, given an 11-year sentence for forced labor. Her husband was also sentenced. He was never shown to have actually hit the women, but clearly knew about it and profited from it. He was given a 3-year sentence. Last thing I'd like to look at today, how to impact corporate behavior. How do we impact companies that many times are very legitimate companies, but are either profiting consciously from trafficking or engaged in what we call in the law field willful blindness. The idea that look the other way because a subcontractor has come to them with a bid that seems too good to be true to pick their oranges, to make their beds in a hotel. It's often the subcontractor who is the trafficker, but it's the major U.S. company that chooses to look in the other way. A number of different tactics to go after this. Legally, it's oftentimes difficult to prove up human trafficking in these cases. Typically, the law requires actual knowledge by the large company so that a prosecutor would have to show they actually knew that there was human trafficking going on and actually chose to deliberately profit from that. That's a very high legal burden. California has introduced a quite interesting and quite groundbreaking law in recent years called the California Transparency in Supply Chains Act. It entered into force in January of 2012. And what it requires is that any business that does business in the state of California that makes at least $100 million in gross receipts, not nearly as much as actually we would normally think. Quite a few companies make that before they pay out their expenses. But what California now requires is for those companies to disclose on their websites to the public what it is, if anything, that they're doing to combat trafficking. Note that this is a disclosure requirement, okay? It doesn't necessarily say we're going to look at companies and require them to do anything to combat trafficking other than give consumers and shareholders the information of whether they are doing anything at all. What this does, it throws the ball back into the hands of the consumer and of shareholders or of religious congregations that may have investments in those companies. Over 3,200 global companies have thus far been impacted. A great many of them, very cynically on their websites, say, we recognize trafficking is bad and we're against it, saying nothing at all about what they're actually doing to combat it. But it's meant to give power back to the people, to the consumers and the shareholders. Second technique, and this has in many ways been pioneered by Catholic religious communities, corporate governance, acting as responsible investors, demanding accountability from the kinds of places where our communities or our, again, at times our religious organizations have investments. Catholic religious sisters have actually led the way in this area of accountability. Thank you all for that. And let's keep up the good work. The last way that operates apart from necessarily suing people or trying to get them in jail, consumer and advocacy pressures. And this is where our coalition of Immokalee workers have been the leaders, not just nationally, but internationally as well. This is, of course, a grassroots farm worker advocacy group based right here in South Florida. And some years ago, they recognized that farm workers were paid only 40 cents for a 32-pound bucket of tomatoes. It required actually our farm workers to pick 2 tons of tomatoes a day, 125 buckets, just to make $50. Our farm workers were making the same amount of money that they had been 30 years before, very, very little. The coalition realized that they could try to sue someone like Taco Bell that was the largest recipient of all those tomatoes, but that this would be very, very difficult to win in court. They also realized it would be very, very difficult to prosecute them. So instead they turned to the U.S. public, and in particular to college students, asking them to boycott Taco Bell until Taco Bell would pay 1 penny more per pound of tomatoes. Taco Bell roundly refused. The coalition then began what became a monumental strike of Taco Bell. How it came to college campuses, college students were asked, after you go drinking on Friday and Saturday nights and you are ready for munchies, go anywhere except Taco Bell to get those munchies. Taco Bell kind of scoffed initially, like, isn't this funny what these college students and farm workers are doing? Within several years, Taco Bell had lost hundreds of thousands of dollars. They had lost the allegiance of one of the biggest consumer groups that they always reach out to, which is young people. And Taco Bell caved in. Taco Bell caved, Burger King, McDonald's, any number of different businesses that have actually now been part of what we call the Fair Food Program that I believe we'll hear more about today, became this great example of how it is that as consumers, we can make sure that we exert the kind of pressure that can combat labor trafficking. Again, 1 penny more per pound. Final thing to look at. Well, I use this a lot with my students, my undergraduate students at Florida State University. It's called My Slavery Footprint. You can Google this, and what it will provide you is a survey in which you're asked, what are the different consumer items that you use? Do you have an iPhone? Do you have a backpack, a bicycle? Do you have, what kinds of clothes do you wear? And what this survey does is then estimates how many slaves work for you to actually create those. It actually looks at the labor supply chains that are involved in each one of those commodities, and it's a great reminder on how all of us, whether we know it or not, may in fact be beneficiaries of slave labor. It also then tells you where is it in the world that some of those products are actually being created where there has been labor trafficking, human trafficking in their supply chains. I want to first of all thank all of you for this kind of very, very quick forced march look at labor trafficking, but it will remain, I believe, one of the great issues for us to address as consumers, as Americans, but in particular as Catholics as well. That again, this notion that the image of God is itself violated when a farm worker, when anyone who is actually working in our economy is exploited, that we all suffer as a result. Thank you for the work that all of you continue to do, and thank you for the chance to join you here this morning. God bless.
Terry, thank you. it is clear that there was no accident to your leaving those fields outside of the Holy Cross. Okay. And traveling your path to us today. It's also clear that you are a teacher. You are a teacher, and you have helped us because you have explained to us that this is a very complex and complicated, almost industry in our country. And you have given us ways to be aware of and attentive to combating it in a variety of ways. I think most of all, though, thank you for your person. It is very clear that you have a passion and an energy, and that you are not just teaching about this from a distance, but you are really engaging it personally. And your witness is worth more than so much of the things that you are doing in terms of being at a college or a university. So we are very grateful for your witness to us today. Thank you. I would now like to invite back to the stage Mary Ellen, Lupe, and Shelby.
Good morning, and thank you very much, Terry. You've helped us learn very well today from your description of labor trafficking, and we also learned a good deal about labor trafficking in the film yesterday that was shown here. And as Mary said, we are following through on the journey that we started 5 years ago in St. Louis with trafficking, and now we're focusing on labor trafficking, because in fact now we are here in Immokalee country. And it is our good fortune to be able to hear Terry and also to have our panelists this morning speak specifically about the Immokalee workers and their experience, and to see how we work together in partnership to address the common goal to stop this kind of trafficking and slavery, not only in the U.S., but around the world. Our hope for this event was to be able to engage with Wendy's, much as we engaged with the Millennium Hotel in St. Louis. Wendy's is the only fast food company, major fast food company, that has not adopted the Fair Food Program. Our congregation, the congregation of St. Joseph, purchased stock this year as a basis for a working relationship with the company, and Terry referred to that in his presentation as well. To date, we have engaged the company in one dialogue, and we've provided a proxy for an Immokalee worker to be present at the Wendy's shareholder meeting this spring. It is just really key that we and the Immokalee workers have a place at the table to speak about our concerns, and that happens when we are co-owners of the company through sharing, holding shares. At this point, Wendy's has not agreed to sign the Fair Food Program, and our hope is that continuing the dialogue that we have started, it will help bring this about in the future, hopefully soon. This would really be strengthened if our individual congregations also purchase stock, because this would raise the amount of support at meetings. It would also provide more proxies that could be shared with the Immokalee workers so that they could go into the meetings and speak for themselves. Earlier this week, 11 congregations in Indiana and Michigan, who are part of CRIM, agreed to purchase stock to support this effort as well. This is just one strategy, and Terry alluded to that. CIW, the Immokalee workers, have chosen another strategy, which is the boycott. And as you know, this is not our way usually of doing our work. We prefer to relate directly with management of the company. But together with both of these strategies, we have greater influence in moving forward. It would also be good for us as individuals to go into Wendy's restaurants and speak with the management there and ask the manager if he or she would speak to their supervisor to talk with the company about sitting down and with the CIW and negotiate fair wages and just working conditions. If you choose to be a part of the boycott, please send a letter to Wendy's telling them why. If the company doesn't know the reason that their income is going down, they won't know what it is that caused that and what made the difference. So we continue this effort of support of the workers, and we'll invite your participation later this morning during the call to action. We hope in the coming months to be able to celebrate a victory with CIW and with Wendy's in the efforts to eliminate labor trafficking and slavery. Also, in response to this action, the Federation Corporate Voice Committee has written a farm worker human rights statement, which is an important and timely document for us. And it's on the Federation website and can be downloaded from there to share with your colleagues, your family, and your friends. So let's hear from CIW.
Bueno, antes que nada, gracias por el espacio y por su tiempo que se están tomando para poder tener esta conversación.
First, thank you all so much for taking the time and giving us this space to be able to share with you all this morning.
Bueno, pues ya creo que muchos de nosotros ya escuchamos que todavía siguen habiendo problemas en la industria agrícola. La coalición está trabajando para poder mejorar esas malas condiciones en que los trabajadores estaban viviendo.
We've already heard this morning that unfortunately bad and abusive conditions continue to persist in the agricultural industry. And so we're here this morning to share about the work that's being done to combat those abuses.
Muchos de ustedes vieron el documental, parece. Ahí se habla cómo la coalición empezó a organizar con los trabajadores y ahora estamos organizando también con los consumidores.
You all have seen Food Chains, the documentary yesterday that talks about how the coalition began to organize among farm workers. And today we'll also share about the process of organizing with consumers and what that consumer movement was like and how it was born.
Todavía hay mucho trabajo que hacer, todavía falta muchas cosas que cambiar, pero lo importante es poder tomar acción, lo importante es poder seguir luchando juntos para que estos cambios lleguen a más trabajadores.
There's so much work that's left to be done, but the important thing is to continue working together as consumers and farm workers to be able to win the changes that are necessary in the fields.
Voy a explicar un poquito sobre el programa por comida justa que se ha logrado gracias a la participación de las corporaciones, pero a la participación también de los consumidores que han ayudado a poder traer a estas corporaciones a firmar un acuerdo con la coalición.
I'm going to explain a little bit about how the Fair Food Program works. This human rights achievement that has been won through the participation of corporations. But that participation of corporations has been made possible through the participation of consumers and calling on corporations to sit at the table with the CIW to talk about how to improve those conditions.
El programa empezó básicamente en el 2010 a trabajarse, a poder hacer varias cosas para poder implementarlo dentro de los ranchos. En el 2010, el 90% de los rancheros llegaron a un acuerdo con la coalición para que nosotros podamos hacer sesiones de educación en los ranchos.
The Fair Food Program began to be implemented in the fields in 2010 after years of working with corporations and growers to bring this partnership to bear on the agricultural industry. And it was in 2010 that for the first time, the Florida Tomato Growers Exchange, which represents 90% of tomato growers in the state of Florida, came to the table with the CIW to be able to actually implement those human rights that we'd been dreaming about and working to implement